I doubt that few infantry battalions ever received a tougher baptism and yet continued, as a unit, for many more operations under its own name. These words were written by former Commander F.M. Griffiths in the foreword to Bloody Buron about the Highland Light Infantry of Canada's first major battle in Normandy. While these words are meant to encapsulate the experience of that brutal battle, it also represents the experience of the battalion through the entirety of the Second World War. They faced adversity multiple times and kept fighting as a unit and always took their objectives. The Highland Light Infantry of Canada, often called simply the HLI, fought through all of Canada's major battles in Northwest Europe during the Second World War. Its distinguished service saw the battalion fight through Normandy, including at what became known as Bloody Buron, at the French Channel ports, the Scheldt, the crossing of the Rhine, and into the Netherlands and Germany. The HLI earned 20 battle honors for its regimental colors from the war. It also accomplished a unique feat that will be discussed later in the video. The HLI mobilized for active service on May 24, 1940. It arrived in Britain during the summer of 1940. At first, the battalion was engaged in offensive duty, protecting the British coast against German invasions, but eventually moved to preparing for the invasion of Europe once the situation had improved for the Allies. This training went on for years. Not until June of 1944 did the HLI finally get into the fight. The HLI landed as part of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade they would fight under for the majority of the war, which was the Reserve Brigade of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division on D-Day, June 6, 1944. They began to come ashore at approximately 1140 hours at Nanwhite Sector in front of Bernay-sur-Mer. Famously, they came off landing craft infantry carrying bicycles, which were initially intended to help them move faster in the advance. As the advance had been slowed around Bernay-sur-Mer, bikes were no longer needed. Eventually, the HLI moved inland, took up positions near Villon-les-Buissons, the area that was dubbed Hell's Corners. Nearly a month in this position until they attacked as part of Operation Charnwood, the Allied attack on Caen. HLI's baptism of fire, fighting at Buron, has been described as the battalion's private agony and its finest hour. Fight to take Buron from the 12th SS has been detailed in another video, which I have linked down below. This video won't be going into details about what happened at Buron because of the previous video. So if you'd like to hear more about that, be sure to check out the video. The capture of Buron on July 8th saw the HLI having a need to reorganize itself due to the high number of casualties, particularly those among leadership positions, and prepare to move into Caen itself. As the HLI moved into Caen, Private Mike Borodenko, who was awarded for his gallantry during the Battle of Buron, relayed a story about his platoon advancing into the city. He said, "We came by an old nunnery. There were 2 big doors. We decided, let's open them. We used a long pole in case of booby trap. In the cellar, there were 4 spigot. We used the pole to turn them, and wine poured out. Captain Joel King came by and found us. Sergeant, corporal, and 6 men all passed out. I know you could be court-martialed for that," he said, "but you had one hell of a day yesterday. I'll just forget it." After Caen was captured in early July, attention was turned to gaining the high ground south of the city. The HLI fought as part of Operation Atlantic. They were tasked with helping to clear Vaucelles on the far side of the Orne River. The HLI War Diary for the beginning of Operation Atlantic on July 18, 1944 read, "The brigade and supporting arms lined the west bank of the River Orne and dug slits, that is, slit trenches, in its ant-infested soil. At 0540 hours, our morale was raised by one of the greatest air assaults of this war. 1,000 Lancasters commenced dropping them on Vaucelles. Pathfinder's flares pointed the way, and the Lancs kept pouring their bombs on the target. Our arty heightened the effect by their fire. At 0645 hours, the medium bombers started their attack on the enemy gun area. At 0730 hours, our artillery barrage built up to a crescendo. Moaning Mimes began to drop in 51st Division area, that's the 51st British Division, across the river and to the south of us. At 0820 hours, the HLI crossed the river and canal bridges, and with 8th Brigade and armor on the left flank, moved toward Faubourg de Vaucelles. Operation Atlantic was a frustrating experience for the HLI. They had difficulty moving toward their objective due to the heavy bombing and German sabotage of the roads, while enemy snipers and machine gun posts held up the units advancing in front of them, further slowing down the advance. It wasn't until the next day, the 19th, that the HLI reached their objectives. 0815 hours, the companies reached their final objective inside the town. The morning was spent in clearing enemies out of the houses. The War Diary recorded intermittent rifle and Sten gun fire heard from most company areas, punctuated by explosion of occasional mines or booby trap roadblocks. They did not stay there for long, as at 1600 hours, B and C companies started to march to Cormel to relieve the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Both companies were mortared severely and were ordered back to old locations of Vaucelles. Units from the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade took over the HLI positions. At 2200 hours, the HLI was on the move again, and by 2345 hours, they were in their new location inside Cormel. For Operation Spring, the HLI was going to be one of the follow-up battalions. The plan was for the North Nova Scotia Highlanders to take Tilly-la-Campagne and then have the HLI move on through to Garcelle de Sancville. However, this did not go to plan, as the North Novas were never able to get the Germans out of Tilly, and therefore the HLI attack into Garcelle-Sancville never happened. The rigors of combat were starting to take their toll on the HLI by this point in the Normandy campaign. They had been in combat for 55 days with little periods of rest. In their war diary for July 26, it's recorded that we have been mortared and shelled with regularity today. Troops are badly in need of a rest, beginning to show signs of nervous strain. The HLI was taken out of the line on July 30th due to the need to have some rest and refitting, but mostly to prepare for the upcoming Operation Totalize, which was due to kick off on August 8th, 1944. As the war diaries for the first half of August were destroyed during a friendly fire incident during the beginning of Operation Tractable in mid-August, we have to rely on different records to understand what happened in this period of the fighting. The HLI's role in Operation Totalize was a minimal one. They were given a follow-up role in that on August 9th, the second day of the operation, they were to follow up the initial advance and occupy a position in Haut-Miniel along the path of the advance. Once they had done this on the 9th, they were ordered to move forward and relieve the 10th Infantry Brigade units in the area of Saint-Hilaire Farm. Under the cover of darkness, the riflemen plodded along the road to their next destination. The relief of the 10th Infantry Brigade was made in short order, and the HLI now found itself in the front line proper. The area was an uncomfortable one with both flanks in the air, and the only approach in the positions was crossing country under observation from the enemy. For the next major operation in Normandy, the HLI were given the job of taking Montpoint during Operation Tractable. The advance began well for the HLI as they were carried across the battlefield in converted armored personnel carriers to protect the infantry and to surprise the enemy with the speed of their advance. However, the biggest event of the day was not about the advance of the HLI, but the friendly fire incident that saw Allied bombers drop their payloads in the areas behind the advance of the 1st Canadian Army instead of the German positions. Luckily for the HLI, their casualties as the result of this bombing were light, and they continued to move south and prepared to help close the Falaise Gap. Early on the afternoon of the 21st, the HLI, supported by the tanks of the 1st Hussars, attacked toward Chambois. They're heavily supported by artillery from the northwest of the town. They eventually made contact with the 1st Polish Armor Division, helping to finally close the gap and bringing this portion of the Battle of Normandy to an end. After the closing of the Falaise Gap, the HLI, along with the rest of 1st Canadian Army, moved on to the Seine. Their war diary for August 29th records, "Today we crossed the famous River Seine. The crossing was uneventful, but enemy were encountered on the other side of the river. Their task largely involved clearing out small pockets of resistance on the other side of the river." It's recorded in the war diary that the troops remain in the highest of spirits and want to push on. On August 30th, they noted that they came under some artillery fire, but they continued to push on and encountered no opposition. One of their patrols moved into Rouen, and it is noted that they shot up a large group of enemy found hurrying along a side street. It's also noted several, and quoting, "fly bomb sites were located, but we had not much chance to examine them as we pushed on. The enemy were reported retreating rapidly, and we pressed on to harass his withdrawal." As August turned into September, the HLI moved deeper into France. By September 6, 1944, the HLI were outside Boulogne, France, at the town of Isques. They were undergoing patrols and moving their way towards the town to gather information for the inevitable assault on the French port. The war diary for September 8th reported that the bombing of German positions around the city had begun. The war diary also noted that morale is very high, the men have a good chance to get cleaned up and are all in high spirits, and a rather humorous inclusion in brackets, not due to Calvados either. The Canadian advances into Boulogne were successful, gradually reducing the German positions in the city. Eventually, only a few positions were still held by the Germans. The commander of the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, Brigadier Rockingham, crafted a message to be delivered to the surrounded German troops via loudspeakers on Canadian vehicles. "You have lost the battle for Boulogne. Over 7,000 prisoners have been taken, and all form of resistance has ceased except this position. You are completely surrounded by a larger force of all arms. If you surrender now, no further casualties will occur on either side, and you and your garrison will be treated as prisoners of war and eventually returned to your families. If, however, you do not surrender with all your garrison, we will attack you with every means at our disposal, during which time we will incur some casualties, but there is no way of assessing how many you will incur. You have 1 hour to make up your mind. Come out with a white flag flying, your hands above your heads, and unarmed, within 1 hour. If this does not occur, we will commence at once to destroy you and your garrison. You have had your warning. Surrender or die from flames." After the delivering of this message, the last German position in Boulogne quickly gave up, surrounded by Canadian troops that included the HLI. The HLI War Diary also summarized the events of that day, September 22nd, 1944. It read, "Today we hope to finish the job of clearing out the last of the enemy. The brigadier suggested that the enemy be told they have one chance to quit, or else we will take very few prisoners of war. This was not necessary, as the enemy folded up quickly in the face of our flamethrowers. Before quitting the forts, the enemy set off great demolitions and destroyed them. Considerable trouble was met in locating the general, that is, the German commander of the garrison, who seemed to skip out just before each point fell. Finally, B Company located, and I'm quoting here, the jerk, and he was immediately escorted to see the brigadier. On the brigadier's orders, General Heim sent word to his troops to surrender, as the heroic, and heroic is in quotes, defense of Boulogne was at an end. There was nothing heroic about the defense, as the enemy readily gave up when he was driven out of his deep concrete holes. Congratulations were received from the GOC and the brigadier for the good job well done, another feather in our cap." The HLI suffered the heaviest at Boulogne. They took 97 casualties to take the port, which included 18 killed. After the fall of Boulogne, the HLI moved on to assist the taking of Calais during Operation Undergo. They were given the job taking one of the large batteries at Cape Grisnez outside the city. The September 29th assault on the battery began at 0635 hours as the artillery opened up, laying down what is quoted as a terrific barrage. The infantry moved forward at 0645 hours, meeting only light resistance. The creeping barrage did an excellent job in keeping the enemy's heads down. As soon as the troops of the HLI got to the enemy positions, white flags started popping up, and a stream of prisoners of war began to flow back behind their lines. By 10:30 hours, all the guns in the Cape had been taken by Canadian troops. However, there were still a few pockets that held out. Those fell by the afternoon. Canadian casualties for the overall attack were very light. After the fall of Cape Grisnez batteries, standard and sword of the German commander of the batteries was sent to the people of Dover in appreciation of the way they stood up under 4 years of shelling from these huge guns. After helping to shut down the big guns outside Calais, the HLI moved into Belgium to prepare for its next attack. This next attack would be known as Operation Switchback, which would see the HLI begin to practice with buffaloes, which were the name given to tracked amphibious personnel carriers, which they would use in the upcoming operation. The attack of the 9th Brigade launched from Terneuzen and went to the west in order to clear the Breskens pocket, which was the objective of Operation Switchback. Despite an initial delay, the troops of the HLI landed on the beachhead and helped to establish the position. October 11th, they moved towards Biervliet, their main objective for Operation Switchback. Upon reaching the outskirts of the town, the Germans withdrew. However, several counterattacks were launched against the HLI positions, were eventually beat back, and the HLI were withdrawn into reserve a few days later. The HLI's next major attack came towards the town of Schoondijk, just south of Breskens, further into the pocket. The advance initially went well, but B Company ran into stiff opposition on the north edge of the town, and according to the War Diary, had to use flamethrowers with their usual excellent results. By 1800 hours, we were in the center of the town, and the shelling was terrific. Casualties were reported remarkably light. A bulldozer was requested to clear a road into the town for our vehicles, as rubble blocked all the roads. Patrol and strength was laid on to patrol to the water on the west side of town, and by 2100 hours, the action had quieted down, and Schoondijk was almost completely in our hands. On October 30th, 1944, troops of the HLI helped to form a bridgehead at Rechangement across the canal that ran next to the town. Further advance took some time as bridges across the canal had to be built in order to support the advance. On the 1st of November, the HLI continued to the west and cleared what was described as a Little Trebroek, formidable strongpoint just east of Nox-sur-Mer in Belgium. Corporal N.E. Tuttle worked under fire for 20 minutes or more, clearing a gap through the German wire. He then led his platoon through it to the assault, winning the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions. After this advance, the HLI went to Ghent for a few days of rest and relaxation. After that, they went on to Nijmegen. For the HLI, the months of November, December, and January were spent in the Nijmegen salient, coming in out of the static positions of the front line, much like the trenches of the First World War. This time was spent doing patrols, trying to take POWs for information, and preparing for the next major advance. That next major advance was codenamed Operation Veritable, one of the largest operations of 1st Canadian Army. It kicked off on February 8th, 1945. The HLI didn't join the operation until February 10th. As this area next to the Rhine River had intentionally been flooded by the Germans to aid their defense, all of the operations that the HLI would undergo in this area of the Rhineland would have to be amphibious operations, moving from town to town in amphibious vehicles such as the Buffaloes. For the HLI's first major attack into Germany, they were given the objective of the town of Duffelward. The initial attack was launched at 1630 hours, but was pushed back with German machine guns covering the only avenue of advance, with B Company suffering 18 casualties and failing to reach their objective. Under the cover of darkness, A Company was able to work their way forward and set up a position to continue advance the next day. On the 11th, the attack went ahead, Duffel Ward, and the next objective of Wardhausen was taken by night with no casualties suffered. In the early hours of February 12th, C Company pushed on to Greethausen. It was at this point that they sent out patrols past their positions and moved on to positions that overlooked the Rhine. The HLI was not to cross the Rhine yet, but was involved in one more major operation in the Rhineland, codenamed Operation Blockbuster. On February 26, 1945, the HLI was part of the attack on Udem, Germany. C and D companies led the assault and captured their first objectives during the late hours on the 26th. A and B companies then passed through them to clear the rear portion of the town. Opposition had stiffened in this part of the town, with German paratroopers holding out in strong positions to slow the advance. It wasn't until first light the next day that much of the resistance was ended. There was a need to bring in tank destroyers to clear out snipers from their strongholds. And by noon that day, the town was cleared of enemy resistance, and all elements of the HLI consolidated their positions. In early March 1945, the HLI were involved in several attacks in the Xanten area to help clean up pockets of resistance on the west side of the Rhine. Once these operations were complete, the HLI was removed from the front line and began for its next operation, the crossing of the Rhine. On March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder, the code name for the crossing of the Rhine by 21st Army Group, began. The HLI war diary recorded, the actual crossing was preceded by a barrage fired by the greatest number of guns ever amassed for one operation on the Western Front. Over 2,000 guns hammered enemy positions and gun areas across the Rhine. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade was fighting under the 154th Highland Brigade of the British Army for Operation Plunder. It was until early on the 24th that the HLI began to move across the river. Our order to move came through at 03:45 hours, and at 04:25 hours, the 4 rifle companies loaded onto buffaloes and crossed the mighty Rhine. The 1st Canadian unit crossing was made under sporadic shelling. On the way to our company area, C Company picked up 30 Volkssturm who were sitting along the dike. Using their 1913-style rifles apparently did not appeal to the Volkssturm, and they were pleased to when C Company accommodated them and sent them along to the POW cage. Once established on the far side of the Rhine, the HLI were given the task of helping to clear the small German town, Speldrop. The 7th Black Watch of the 154th Brigade had been sent along to take Speldrop, but had run into opposition, with elements cut off inside the town. It took 2 days for the HLI to help clear it out and consolidate on the far side of it. The war diary described the battle. Houses had to be cleared at the point of the bayonet, and single Germans made suicidal attempts to break up our attacks. Wasp flamethrowers were used to good effect. It was necessary to push right through the town and drive the enemy out into the fields where they could be dealt with. After the successful crossing of the Rhine, the HLI came back under Canadian command and continued the advance back into the Netherlands. Once back onto Dutch soil, the HLI fought at places like Herenberg, coming up against old fortifications that the Germans stubbornly held onto, while moving into places like Zutphen and Dienfer. By mid-April 1945, the HLI was working its way to the North Sea. They moved via places like Leeuwarden and Groningen to reach smaller towns on the Dutch coast. Following these operations, the HLI began to move its way back into Germany. Their last major assault came against the town of Leer. This assault was another river crossing across the Ems River. Once the HLI crossed into Leer, German resistance was very light, and they were able to take the town on April 28, 1945. May 4th, 1945, all the companies of the Highland Light Infantry were in position outside the German town of Ulrich. The war diary noted, here was the answer to 5 years of prayer. O group was held at 18:30 hours to put everybody in the picture, and the ceasefire attitude was hard to grasp. At 20:30 hours, the BBC announced that all German forces in northwest Germany, Holland, and Denmark would capitulate at 0800 hours, the 5th of May, 1945. A strange atmosphere prevailed. Everybody appeared happy and relieved, but no mood for rejoicing developed. May 8, 1945, VE Day, the battalion attended a ceasefire church parade in Aurich, Germany. At 1500 hours, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced over the BBC that hostilities would officially cease on May 9, 1945. After staying in position for several days, the battalion moved back to the Netherlands in the process of returning home. The Overseas Battalion was officially disbanded on January 15, 1946. July had several unique accomplishments during the war. Once they took a piece of ground, it was never given up. No man of the battalion was ever taken prisoner by the enemy, and no man was reported missing. This is quite the achievement for a battalion that fought during the largest conflict in human history.